sitting here with Danish documentary film director Janus Metz at the Mayfair Hotel during London's film festival. Now, Janus, you have been to the trenches of Afghanistan, the sun, the desert, the heat, and now sitting here after having received great reception, winning the Semaine de la Critique in Cannes, Toronto Film Festival, getting a great reception, and now here in London. The change couldn't be more drastic. Now tell me, how did you get involved with this project? What made you decide to make this film?
Well, the film just came about in a slightly, I'd say, incidental manner. For me, I'd finished like a flip-side portrait of marriage migration that screened on Danish television and toured a couple of festivals, and I've been working with those films for 3 years. And then I was thinking about, what am I going to do next? And I was thinking about, that it was striking to me that no one had done any real documentary work on the Danish soldiers and on the war in Afghanistan. And so shortly after that, I go to the Roskilde Festival in Denmark, and I meet an old friend of mine, Kasper, who's also Kasper Torsting. He's also a documentary director, and he was at the time working in a production house called Fridtjof Film in Denmark, and they were in the process of making 6 documentaries for Danish television by 6 different directors on the war in Afghanistan. So he encouraged me to be part of this project, and we spoke about different ideas, and he, I was willing to go to Afghanistan to film combat units. And that he had obviously a hard time finding someone who would undertake that task. So we kind of met on that ambition. So actually Armadillo started out as a half-hour TV documentary, and it just kind of blew the limits for that.
Starting at the Roskilde Music Festival to Afghanistan. Excellent. So why did you want to make this film?
Well, I mean, the shared ambition with Kasper and Fridtjof Film was that no one was really talking about the war in Afghanistan. I mean, this was back in 2009, summer of 2009, that I met Kasper, and he'd already been working with the idea for a while at that time, and he'd already negotiated access with the army. So, the project was to kind of bring the war back into people's living rooms and make them relate to what was going on.
And this, as you say, bringing the war into people's living rooms, the film is extremely intimate, and you really get to know the characters as if it were a dramatic narrative film. That's a theme which runs throughout the film. But what sort of preparation went into this film in the terms of research and getting to know your subjects?
I always do a tremendous amount of research for the films that I make. I learned from the first film that I did, where I was filming for 3 months in South Africa, and it took me 8 months to actually edit the material. Learning how, filmic language, in a sense, that you need to know what story you're pursuing, and the way that you find out about that is to do research and to work with the characters you're going to film. So I spent about 6 months preparing the shoot before we went to Afghanistan, and that was a question of talking to soldiers that had already been to Afghanistan, who'd come home, doing visual research, watching other films, and then finally meeting the subjects that are in the film and talking to them about their life stories, their motivations, their choices, and also going on with them on exercises in Denmark to find out, is it possible at all? How can we film in combat, and what kind of group dynamics are at play between these guys?
You talked about other films you were watching. Were there any sort of inspirational sources that you looked at and said, okay, this is something akin to what I would like to make.
No, not in that sense. I mean, I find my own story, and I'm looking for, what's there. But obviously, when you start working with things and you start to dig out the themes and the subjects you want to be working, you find in that material. Often you find that other films have touched on those kind of things, and there is, an analysis in other films that you can. I mean, this is just your typical way of gathering, of looking into a subject. And I mean, for me, it was quite clear that the sort of fall from grace story or heart of darkness narrative that's played out in Armadillo is mirrored in films like Apocalypse Now and The Deer Hunter. It was clear that the sort of mediated experience of war and the whole sort of what you could say training of the cynical soldier is portrayed very well in a film like Full Metal Jacket. The absence and surreality of modern warfare and the difficulty in coming home is portrayed in a film like Jarhead. So I mean, when you look into those things, you're just exploring. You're exploring war, and you're exploring narrative, and you're exploring images of war. Platoon was a good reference in terms of how the characters are played out against each other in Armadillo.
Can you tell us a bit about the characters? You were following primarily two characters, Metz and Daniel. How did you find them, select them?
Well, I mean, I really wanted to do a thorough casting process for this film because I thought it was very important that the people who were in the film were in there for the right reasons and that they had, a motivation for being in the film rather than just wanting to be on television. So first of all, it had to be voluntary, obviously, which is important when you're speaking with the army because not everything is. And I was very interested in getting to know various possible subjects, also to limit out, let's say, the possibility that the army would give me someone that I thought would be representative. But the first time I came to the army barracks, after having all these discussions with the officers and the leaders of that mission in Afghanistan about the possibility of casting my own subjects, they just they said second platoon, first group, you're in. I knew that we're there on a voluntary basis, but I don't know why they were chosen, and I didn't have the possibility to choose others. But I think I just trusted my own. I believe that every person holds a story, and it's just a question of getting to know what that is. And those would, there was 10 guys in that group, and they looked like they looked like a good solid group of people and a good mix. There was a tall one, a small one, and a fat one, and a funny one, and
your average group of soldiers.
Yeah, it didn't look too bad. So I was like, okay, I'll go with these guys and see what they're like. If they're completely impossible, then I'll find someone else. And they just ended up being the ones in the film. But obviously, I quite quickly found out that you have Metz, who's the small guy who wants to be a real man and who wants to kind of live up to this idea of a soldier identity that Daniel in a sense portrays. And Daniel is like the alpha male of the group, but Daniel's also a very dark character. I mean, he has some he's the type of person that he's very much of a go-getter, but he's also very pragmatic and can be cynical. So in that sense, you have within the group you have the small guy who wants to be like the big guy and get his recognition, but the big guy represents something that is ultimately challenging to, you know, a soft humanitarian, open, maybe naive approach to life. And for me, that was the bigger picture of the war. It was clashing humanitarian development aid work with military cynicism, and I mean that's what we're trying to do in these types of democracy wars. We send military out to on paper make, you know, a place like Afghanistan a better place, and you know, act like development workers even, and that's a situation that's so full of dilemmas and paradox. And I saw that conflict mirrored within the group of, even within that group of soldiers.
And Daniel, in fact, was one of the very central people in what is perhaps the most controversial, most talked about situations in the film, where towards the end they're in a very close quarters fight, and Daniel, he throws a grenade into a ditch, killing 3-4 Taliban fighters, 5. Was it difficult for you to maintain sort of a professional distance and not get too emotionally involved, or did you want to get emotionally involved? How did it feel for you seeing these things happen right in front of you and having to deal with it and put it into a cinematic perspective?
Yeah, I mean,
you tried to keep it quite apolitical, but was it difficult?
No, it's not an apolitical film. It is a political film, but it's not political in the sense that it's overtly taking a political standpoint. But it's, excuse me, breakfast. It's political in the sense that it looks at micro mechanisms or micro politics of war. What's going on the ground? What's happening between the soldiers? What's happening between the soldiers and the civil Afghanis? And how does that affect the conflict at large? Or how could we think about that affecting the conflict at large? So it's definitely political and moralistic in a lot of ways, but it's not political in the way that we traditionally think about political film. I hate when people say that something is apolitical, because I don't think you can make an apolitical film. You can reproduce the power structure that's already in place, and I think that's very problematic if you do that unquestioned. And that most journalism and filmmaking from Afghanistan does that. It takes for granted what the soldiers are telling you about the situation. And what I was concerned with in Armadillo was to look at the things that the soldiers can't see. You know, look at the way that they make sense of the situation themselves, to legitimize what they're doing, but also point out that's their way of making sense of the situation. It's not necessarily the way that the situation is played out, because it's a very complex issue in Afghanistan. And coming back to working with the characters, I mean, I always see myself in a sense as an anthropologist filmmaker, that, you know, I participate in the situation to observe the situation, and that touches on the basic dilemmas of embedded filmmaking. I think to make a good documentary, you have to be embedded. But, I mean, to make a good documentary about real people and characters and unfold those characters. But when you embed yourself with an army, you're facing controversy. And you have to be very careful to try and distance yourself and be able to not overtake their rationality. And the way we did that, I mean, first of all, I was working very closely together with photographer Lars Skræ, who's I worked with on previous projects. He's a very good friend of mine. He's very reflected and you know, he's a thinker, and we're good at having discussions about what we're doing and you know, the things that we're experiencing together. We didn't sleep together with the soldiers. We made sure we had our own room, so they had their space. We had
in the camp.
In the camp. And we also chose to leave once in a while to come back to the war and to enable us to clear our perspective, so to speak.
But you were there on and off throughout the whole tour of the soldiers?
We were there all together for 3.5 months, and they do a tour of 7 months, including leave.